Why were sanctuaries in Magna Graecia built in these precise locations within distinctive landscapes? How was a numinous ambience created and enhanced through the setting of the sanctuaries? What might the location of sanctuaries tell us about sound and auditory culture in antiquity? The answers to these questions may not be fully recoverable, yet the interaction of luminosity and soundscape, as well as the viewing and listening by worshippers, is worthy of exploration. In this paper, I will discuss the immediate natural environment around the area in Magna Graecia, and especially in Poseidonia, a specified loci for sound experience and for musical and choral performances, particularly during processions. I will then address the implications of the landscapes and soundscapes of these sanctuaries and how sacred sounds and sensory ambience contributed to improve religious experiences. This issue concerns the analysis of the concept of a sacred landscape, which is best understood as a dialogue between the built cultic environment and its natural surroundings. This dialogue informs us both about sacred experiences and the formation of local identities in worship context in a process of communication and perception of religious actions that is dependent upon its performative context. One way of dealing with this is to study cultic archaeological sites from the perspective of the rituals performed within them: processions, sacrifices, dance, music, sounds, and dramatic enactments of myths. This approach, which has gained stronger prominence in recent decades and has become known as the archaeology of performance, has emerged as an aspect of the work in progress Sonic Heritage project that I am managing at the Institute of Heritage Science at the National Research Council of Italy. Poseidonia was founded at the end of the 7th century BC in the southern half of an extended fertile plain near the Bay of Salerno. Both of the hills adjacent to the sea form the natural boundaries and of its territory to the east, south, and west, while its northern extent is defined by the river Sele, which today separated the Piana di Pestum from the Piana di Salerno. The fact that two of the colony's major sanctuaries belong to Hera indicates that her cult must have been of great significance at Poseidonia. Indeed, at the time of the colony's foundation, space was set aside in the southern part of the city for Atemenos, which was primarily dedicated to Hera. The vast amount of votive offerings, which provide evidence for the continuity of the cult from the late 7th century BC until Roman times, and the area's two magnificent temples, the so-called Basilica, devoted to Hera, and the Temple of Neptune, probably devoted to Apollo, where terracotta figurines and pinnacles with musical representations were found, which date to the 6th and 5th century BC, reflect the importance of this sanctuary for this polis. The other Eraion at the Foce del Sele is located about 8.5 kilometers north of the city. This Eraion was discovered on the southern side of the river Sele by Paola Zancani Montoro and Umberto Zanotti Bianco in 1934. Apart from some prehistoric shards, no evidence for previous occupation of the site has been found. In contrast to the urban Eraion, which might already have had a temple around 508 to 570 century BC, the earliest temple of the Foce del Sele is the building to which the famous metopes belonged. Another early structure is a dining building in the northern part of the Temenos, which dates to about 500 BC. The rich archaeological material from the site, whose date range is similar to that of the urban sanctuary, also reflects its significance. Among the votive offerings related to the worship of Hera as a tutelary goddess of women, children, and marriage. As the other great Herae in Magna Grecia, especially those of Metaponto and Crotone, the sanctuary of the Foce del Sele was located outside the polis and was devoted to the Hera cult, one of the most important forms of worship in the Argive Peloponnesian religious tradition. Indeed, the extra-urban location of the sanctuary and its connection with a large surrounding territory could be considered very similar to the sanctuaries devoted to the great goddess Hera, especially with regard to the sanctuary at Argos. In the Heraion at Poseidonia, the lush natural environment of which the goddess was the patroness was closely related to the river Sele. Its water enriched the core of Poseidonia, making possible both agricultural exploitation and animal husbandry, and especially the domestication of a horse. Moreover, archaeological research allows us to recognize a large area between architectural space and the surrounding landscape devoted to the Alsos, the sacred grove. The sanctuary at Poseidonia, which was located in a natural environment and was immersed in a sacred grove, is comparable not only with the Raion in Argos, but also with the Hera sanctuaries in Corinth and in Samos. In addition, these sanctuaries included both cultivated and wild elements of the landscape alongside man-made votives and buildings. Such an environment could recall or even evoke divine presence through the contrasting elements in these sanctuaries, since Hera herself is the goddess of the cultivated and wild landscape. If the sacred grove at the Foce del Sele, along with other natural elements, contributed to the evocation of a numinous atmosphere, it is worth noting that the Alsos was traditionally a space of sonic decorum, a locus amenus suffused with the soft soundscape of nature. Thus, in the Alsos of the sanctuary at the Foce del Sele, a cold water stream could be heard, trickling through branches and leaves rustled sleepily in the breeze. These sound impressions harmonized with the festivities celebrated by worshippers. The Alsos of the Raion at the Foce del Sele was particular to its landscape and the specific story of the sanctuary. It could be considered both functional and symbolic. In this ancient Celtic context, we might designate a sound mark as any emotionally and symbolically charged sonic maker, usually extraordinary or even wondrous in nature, that was distinctive to the cult's locale, be it in features of the natural landscape, ritual practices, or some combination thereof. Sound marks were heard as real auditory phenomena, integral to primary, on-site Celtic experience, inspiring in worshippers' fascination and awe, as well as a sense of involvement in a numinous moment. The study of architectural structures of the sanctuary at the Foce del Sele provides the overall framework of its spaces suitable for ceremonies and festivals. As Dieter Mertens has argued, the processional way proceeded from the center of the city to a large temenos. In this sacred space, which was defined and delimited to the north and south by rooms suitable for festive banquets of the worshippers, many vessels for wine and votive offerings were found. Moreover, it cannot be discounted that the Irion was the place of arrival of solemn processions related to the hecatomb devoted to the goddess, like the one celebrated at Prosimna in Argos. Taking into consideration that a wide sacred path crosses the sanctuary, processions could be performed in the Irion of Poseidonia, which, as it is well known, were one of the most important events in celebration. In Ascolium to Pindar, the festival celebrated in Argos is described as a great procession during which 100 oxen were paraded and led to be sacrificed. According to Mario Torelli, the maintenance of this magnificent festival in all the Achaean colonies in Magna Graecia could explain the placement extramania of the Erae in Metaponto, Crotone, and Poseidonia. These preserved the traditional solemn processions performed in the homeland, which, as in Argos, could have included the games. These processions were not only occasions for young boys to compete in races, but also for young girls to perform ritual dances, exposing themselves to the admiration of young boys during the processions and under the goddess's protection. It worth noting that in the Irion at the Foce del Sele, 5 bone alloy fragments were discovered, and other fragments were also found in the southern sanctuary. The aulos, the instrument that embodied the true festival spirit, accompanied the processional approach to the shrine, since it was the instrument of the prosodion, a choral lyric sung, for the procession which often reinforced the celebratory solidarity of the Pompeii. The singing of hymns or paeans were a customary part of the sacrificial ceremony. Indeed, the instrument was played during the different stages of the rituals, and it accompanied the dances performed in sacred spaces, also devoted to Hera. Among the auloi related to the Hera sacred sphere, the first example was found in the Irion in Samos. It is a fragment dating to the 7th century BC and belongs to a single short bronze pipe which has 3 preserved holes. In the sanctuary in Samos, an annual festival named Tonaia was celebrated, during which the statue of the goddess was carried in procession from the sanctuary to the sea and then returned. After the sacrifice, Hera was celebrated with a banquet. This festival was focused on the search for the idol, the ritual bath, the procession, and the dressing. It is important to note that clay statuettes of the so-called naked goddess were discovered at the Foce del Sele. This iconographic type represents the xoanic idol of the goddess depicted in a hieratic pose. This evidence at the Hera sanctuary in Poseidonia seems to recall not only the ritual practices devoted to the goddess, but also dramatic enactments related to her mythical sphere. Indeed, in the Hera myth, an episode appears, the discovery of the wooden idol, which was kidnapped and hidden in a bush, its bath in the river, and its transfer by the priestesses in charge of dressing the goddess statue during a procession through the sacred grove. Despite the fact that written sources related to the origin of the Tonaia do not explicitly refer to choral performances, according to Andreas Furtwängler, competitions and choral dances might have been performed during this Samian festival, given that the festival appears very similar to the Raia in Argos, where musical and gymnastic competitions were performed. Archaeological evidence seems to confirm this hypothesis. Indeed, in the Samianidria fragment dating to the 7th century BC, two groups of dancing girls holding their hands are represented on two registers. Their dance in a circle is accompanied by a female aulos player. She is playing her small instrument in an open space immersed in a natural environment with rich vegetation. Moreover, a bronze statuette representing an aulos player wearing the Bellia and a male figurine in faience dating to the 7th century BC were also found in the Rayon in Samos. They are further evidence of the sacred function of this instrument in the ritual activities performed in this century. In addition, as Claude Calam has argued, the aulos might have been played in order to propitiate the gods to boost fertility during the Samian rituals devoted to Hera. In this regard, it is very interesting to note that a laconic cup with the depiction of an erotic scene was found in the Rayon. We do not know if the Samian festival was also celebrated in Poseidonia. However, we can assume that the aulos sound marking served to bond the worshipping group closely together, as well as to accompany dances, deepening percentual sympathies between members. It is interesting to note, to point out that in addition to the alloy fragments, some handmade terracottas, which depict groups of women on round bases, were discovered at the sanctuary of the Foce del Sele. Each of them originally comprised of 5 figurines, which were arranged in a circle. 4 figurines hold hands while the 5th plays the aulos. The terracottas were made by a local workshop and stylistically date to the beginning of the 6th century BC. As suggested by Maria Sestieri Bertarelli, the clay female groups could be related to the circular dances performed in the sanctuaries devoted to Hera, not only in Magna Graecia, where groups of female dancers in a circle dating to the 6th century BC were found in the Rayon in Crotone and in Poseidonia, obviously, but also in Tiryns, where some clay groups of dancers were found. The latter seem as true. They were made and modeled at Argos. It is worth noting that, as previously highlighted, figures of female dancers are depicted on the metopes of the sanctuary at Foce del Sele. In this regard, as a space for choral performance under the protection of Hera, this sanctuary can be considered a dancescape, a ritual space used as a dance venue and mapped across the sacred place. As Timothy Power has argued, sound marking and audition in ritually concentrated and more promiscuous forms were present at virtually all stages of processions. The festivals that were often their dedication points were complex soundscape that fully engaged the ear of the worshippers. They could hear musical performances of all kinds, appearances, outbursts, and acclamations, the buzzing noises of crowds, and the sounds of sacrifice made by animals, instruments, and worshippers, including most strikingly the Oliloge, the shrill cry raised by women as the animal was killed, which Walter Burkert memorably called life streaming over death. To try to record here the various acoustic practices and phenomena of the processional path at the sanctuary at the Foce del Sele would result in a dense cacophony. Our evidence, Lacunus do, it includes manifestations of sacred sounds, the Celtic sound mark, for the complex Celtic landscape in this place. Thus, considering the full sensory spectrum of the sacred procession, we must take into account the effect of the babble of voices, movements, music, colors, smells, and visual impressions. the architecture, the shrine set on the river Sele, the greenery around the temple, redolent with a delightful scents and surrounded with metopes, all contributed to a sense of the sacred, but the most powerful key to the creation of a sacred environment was sound as well as music and dance. As Clemente Marconi has argued, figural decorations also contributed to the effort of ritual performance, which would have included the various acts of worship in the sacred space. In conclusion, processions at the Raion at Poseidonia did not merely involve passive auditors. Participants also generated their own sounds, performing as musicians, chorus members, and vocalizing officiants not only at the destination sanctuary, but on the processional path as well. The processional paths in sanctuary at the Foce del Sele were not simply settings for ritual, but a tangible expression of a community behavior. Music and dance activities performed in this sanctuary were intended to maximize the effects of the ceremony and reinforce the solidarity agenda by these practices in a cultic landscape. Active participation in processing, listening, and viewing created a communitas of a shared experience. Thus, sounds created a sacred environment with incenses smoking on altars, horses visible nearby through flowering bushes, and wine to be consumed in vessels by worshippers. The goddess presides over all. Above all, it was the presence of Hera that human souls and might find in the sanctuaries created and prepared for her arrival. Thank you so much for your attention.